I don't know what it is about engineers and helicopters, but somehow they treat every problem like it's a math riddle instead of a machine that's refusing to do its job. Which is how we ended up at Redstone Airfield on a Monday morning in June, staring at a grounded UH-72 Lakota that had refused to lift off for 3 straight days. The heat was thick enough to spread with a knife, and you could hear the frustration in the silence, the kind where no one's yelling because they've already tried everything. 3 engineers stood around the bird, sleeves rolled up, safety glasses pushed up on their heads like they tried to look busy for a photo op, and then gave up. One of them, a contractor from Bearing Aerotech, had a laptop balanced on a storage crate, running a diagnostic that blinked out the same sentence every time. Rotation, fault, unresolved, input. That same phrase had eaten through $14,000 of man-hours and a generous amount of professional pride. They'd changed the starter, replaced a sensor array, updated the firmware twice, still dead, and the brass was getting pissed. Why? Because the helicopter wasn't just another test model, it was the bird scheduled to fly a VIP demo for NATO liaisons that Thursday. A custom retrofitted model with anti-vibration stabilizers, redundant fuel routing, and a hybrid cooling system that, so far, was proving more theoretical than functional. General Marla Kent, the kind of officer who didn't raise her voice because her eyebrows already did the job, stood nearby with her arms folded. She wasn't blinking. That made everyone more nervous than if she had been yelling. Finally, she said, "Any of you want to explain why 3 days of expert work has left me with a very expensive paperweight?" No one answered. One of the engineers coughed. "We believe there's a sensor feedback loop inside the rotational timing module." "I didn't ask what you believe," she said. He shut up. Kent turned to her aide, a sharp lieutenant who looked barely old enough to rent a car, and said something that no one expected to hear. "Call Garver." The aide hesitated. "Ma'am, are you sure?" "I'm tired of fancy laptops telling me a blade won't spin. Get me Garver." The engineers looked at each other. One even whispered, "Who?" And that's where the story actually starts. Dale Garver had been off the books for a while. No official post. No uniform. Not even a valid DoD email anymore. Last anyone heard, he was living in a trailer in Tennessee with a mutt named Diesel and a busted radio he refused to replace out of principle. He used to be a warrant officer, the kind who didn't say much but could take apart a Black Hawk blindfolded and put it back together with a Leatherman and a bent coat hanger. He served through 3 conflicts, 5 base rotations, and a dozen systems upgrades that he didn't trust even when he helped write the manuals. Garver didn't retire in the traditional sense. He just stopped answering the phone, and eventually people stopped calling, except Kent. She'd served with him back in Kandahar, back when helicopters still sounded like lawnmowers trying to win a race, and nobody cared about algorithms as long as the damn rotor spun. He owed her. She cashed it in. When Garver arrived, he didn't wear anything official. Worn boots, jeans, a faded army tee, and a belt with a wrench pouch instead of a holster. His hair was silver, cut short but not military short. His walk had the kind of hitch you earn from years of impact landings and sleeping on cold steel. He didn't salute, didn't shake hands. He just said, "Point me to the bird." Kent smiled. "Glad you still speak machine," he snorted. "It's people I forget how to talk to." The engineers were less thrilled. One of them, clipboard in hand, offered the usual download. "We've gone through the full diagnostic cycle 5 times, including manual spin calibration and software reflash. We also swapped out the EGT probe just in case it was causing a false." Garver walked past him mid-sentence. Didn't stop. Didn't nod. He climbed into the cockpit, sat for a second, flicked a few switches, then got out. "Where's the manual throttle linkage?" The lead engineer blinked. "It's been replaced with an electronic actuator per spec." Garver raised an eyebrow. "That right?" "And did you check the mechanical resistance on it?" "It's digital." "That's not what I asked. Another awkward silence. Garver popped open a side panel and shimmied halfway into the guts of the engine housing. For 10 minutes, all you could see were his legs sticking out while he muttered things like, "These idiots routed a heat loop next to the sensor bus. And Christ, no wonder it chokes." Eventually, he climbed out, tossed a cable clamp onto the tarmac, and stood up. "There's your problem." Kent folded her arms. "Let's hear it." This actuator harness is running adjacent to the return line for the hybrid cooler. Every time the line heats up under pressure, the heat bleed causes a fluctuation in the feedback circuit. Basically, your engine thinks the rotation is stalling when it's just getting a thermal ghost signal. One of the engineers started to protest, but the system's supposed to compensate. "Yeah," Garver interrupted, "assuming the compensation code didn't get throttled in your firmware patch." He tossed a flash drive at him. "That's your last update. You disabled live thermal recalibration to reduce delay on startup. You broke your own bird." The engineer stared. "How did you even get that file?" Garver ignored him. "Give me a half hour and a clamp shield. And tell that intern to stop standing on the fuel line." The intern looked down, jumped off the hose, and quietly backed away. 31 minutes later, the Lakota's engine fired up like it had been waiting for someone to believe in it again. No stalls, no errors. Just a clean spin, tight cycle, and a quiet purr that said, "I'm ready." Garver stepped back, wiped his hands on a rag that was already dark with grease, and muttered, "Now that's a sound." Kent approached. "Still got it." "Didn't lose it," he said, not bragging, "just stating a fact." She handed him a bottled water. "They'll offer you a contractor badge by tomorrow." "Won't take it." "Why?" He looked at the helicopter. "Because they'll ask me to fix things their way." Then he walked off toward the parking lot. Kent just watched him go. One of the engineers finally asked, "Ma'am, who was that?" She smiled. "That was someone who used to fix the machines before we taught them how to lie." 3 days after Garver fixed the Lakota, the engineers were still mad. They wouldn't say it out loud, of course. But it showed in how they avoided eye contact when someone mentioned his name, in how they changed their posture when the general was around, and in how none of them touched the helicopter without pretending to check something on a tablet first. The bird ran perfectly now. Flawless cycles. No more false stalls. A clean diagnostic profile that looked like it had been minted by the manual itself. But that only made it worse, because none of them had fixed it, and more importantly, none of them really understood what had gone wrong. Which meant they were just one failure away from looking incompetent all over again. In the operations office, General Kent was reviewing a formal after-action summary when her aide stepped in. "Ma'am, message from Fort Irwin. They've requested tech support for a similar issue. UH-72 fleet. Same model, early cycle faults. They want to know if we're sending the same team." Kent raised an eyebrow. "The same team that didn't fix it," her aide coughed. "They also asked if Garver is available." She didn't answer right away. Then, "He's not." "Should I tell them?" "Tell them to run a full heat trace between coolant lines and actuator harnesses. Then re-enable live recalibration in firmware. If that doesn't work, they can go play hacky sack in the desert." "Yes, ma'am." "And don't log that in the system," she added. Garver doesn't need his name floating around again. Garver, meanwhile, was back in Tennessee. Well, back is a strong word. He hadn't left so much as returned to the radius he tolerated. He was sitting under a rusted-out carport, sharpening a pocket knife. Diesel the Mutt curled at his feet when a black SUV rolled up his dirt road. He didn't stand, didn't wave, just kept sharpening. 2 men stepped out. One was clean-cut, base-issue Buzz, wearing the wrong boots for gravel. The other looked more relaxed, aviators, a weathered jaw, and a tan that only came from actually working outdoors. "Mr. Garver," the buzzcut said. "Depends who's asking." "We're with the Joint Systems Coordination Office." Garver paused. "That a real thing?" "Yes, sir." "Then I don't want anything to do with it." He went back to the knife. The other man stepped forward. "We're here unofficially. Fort Stewart's having some issues. CH-47s this time. You come highly recommended, Garver smirked. From who? The man smiled. Let's just say a certain general thinks the engineers are in over their heads again. Garver sighed, set the knife down. What kind of issue? Same as before. Rotor sync fault. System reads as good. Bird won't fly. New firmware. Yes. Thermal bleed. Doesn't look like it. Then it's deeper. The buzzcut perked up. What do you mean by deeper? Garver looked at him like a disappointed uncle. I mean, whoever wrote the control logic either never flew one of these birds, or they did and wanted it to fail under the right conditions. Buzzcut frowned. That's a serious claim. I wasn't making a claim, I was making a guess, but now you're nervous, so maybe I'm closer than I thought. The man with aviators nodded. We can fly you out in the morning. Nope. Evening? Nope. Then when? Garver stood stretched. If I go on my own. My tools, my terms, and no one follows me around with a clipboard. The men exchanged looks. Understood, the older one said. Garver pointed to Buzzcut. Leave that one home. He blinks too much. When he arrived at Fort Stewart 2 days later, the story was the same. Bird won't fly. Diagnostics looked clean. Engineers stumped. Command frustrated. But this time, something felt different. The CH-47 in question had been retrofitted with a new synchronization system, one meant to ensure rotor timing during simultaneous engine transitions. A good idea on paper. But on the tarmac, the thing behaved like it had a mind of its own. Garver didn't even open a panel first. He just sat in the cockpit, ran his fingers over the console like it might whisper back. Then he leaned over and said something quietly, as if the machine were a stubborn mule. Don't lie to me, sweetheart. You know better. Then he started pulling panels. It took him half a day to find it. Buried under a housing plate labeled non-user serviceable, he found a secondary processor module, something the specs never mentioned. Garver frowned, pried it out. The chip was marked with a tiny logo, a stylized D over a winged gear. Defense mech, of course. He ran a loopback on the connector. Instead of linking into the flight control directly, it fed data through an intermediary path, not to optimize flight, but to log response lag. Someone was measuring failure, testing it, learning from it. He checked the serial on the module. Didn't exist in the registry. Garver took a picture, slipped the module into a shielded pouch, and quietly left the hangar. That night, he met with the base commander, a worn-out colonel who'd been trying to keep everything out of headlines. Garver dropped the pouch on the table. This is your problem. The colonel opened it, blinked. That's not standard issue. Nope, which means either someone's tampering or defense mechs back to playing God with prototypes again. But we didn't authorize anything new. Garver looked at him hard. That's the problem. You think authorization is protection. It's not. The colonel sighed. What would you do? Strip every retrofit bird of that module, quietly. Do it after hours. Don't log anything. Won't that cause a chain reaction? No, that module is the chain reaction. You remove it, you save lives. Garver stayed in a storage bay that night, didn't like hotels. Too many cameras. In the morning there was a note under his cot, folded, neat, smelled faintly of engine oil. Inside, one line. They're not testing birds, they're testing people. Garver didn't sleep much after that. Because he knew the voice behind that message, the handwriting. It was from a guy he thought was long gone. A guy who'd walked away from the same kind of secrets Garver had helped bury years ago. Red, which meant this wasn't just about engines anymore. It was about something bigger. Something coming. Garver didn't like being followed. He especially didn't like being followed by amateurs, which is exactly what happened on his second day at Fort Stewart. They weren't subtle. Black sedan, tinted windows, driver pretending to check a clipboard every time Garver turned around. Same guy at the PX. Same guy parked across from the motor pool that afternoon, pretending to be on the phone but never dialing. He didn't approach, just watched. Garver knew the type. Private contractors. Not military, not civilians, and definitely not cleared to exist on any official budget sheet. They were watching him now, which meant the chip he'd pulled from the CH-47 had hit a nerve. That evening, he made a call. It wasn't a normal call. It was through a relay ham radio node hidden in the back of his old work truck, one that still had a Tennessee license plate and a loose bolt in the dash that squeaked every 6 seconds. He keyed the mic, took a breath, and said, "Dusty Mop, Midnight Isle, come clean." Silence, then static, then a voice dry, faintly amused. "You always did suck at code." Garver grinned. "Red, you slippery bastard." They met in a diner 20 miles off base. One of those side-of-the-road spots with cracked linoleum and a jukebox that hadn't worked since 2002. No cameras. No Wi-Fi. Just black coffee and waitresses who minded their own business. Red looked older, not in a worn-out way, in a quieter way. Like a man who had stopped shouting at machines because he'd learned they shouted back in code. He slid into the booth across from Garver like he hadn't been presumed dead 6 months earlier. Garver didn't say anything for the first minute, just sipped his coffee and stared. Then, "Where the hell have you been?" Under the rug, like every problem that gets too real. Garver nodded slowly. "So it was you, the note under the cot." Red tapped the table twice. "Figured you'd find the chip." Garver pulled the defense mech module from his coat and dropped it on the table. "What the hell are they doing?" Red didn't touch it. "They're mapping thresholds. Trying to figure out how far a machine can fail before a human blinks." Garver frowned. "Fail on purpose?" Red nodded. "Think of it like this. You've got a control system that can compensate for heat, torque, oscillation, but someone tells it not to, just slightly. Just enough to cause a delayed stall under the right conditions. Why? Because they want to know what failure looks like on a human level. How long before the pilot notices? What's the average reaction time? What kind of failure causes panic versus confidence?" Garver blinked. "They're not testing equipment." "No," Red said. "They're testing soldiers." Garver sat back in his booth. He didn't like where this was going. "You telling me this is some kind of behavioral metrics program? More like a risk-response conditioning model." Defense Mech calls it Project Sentry Loop. Garver winced. "They've been floating that name for years. Always thought it was just vaporware." Red shook his head. "It was vaporware until they started injecting failure modules into real hardware. Now it's evolved." "How far does it go?" Red pulled a folded map from his coat and laid it flat on the table. A dozen bases were marked with red circles. Every one of these has had a component malfunction in the last 6 months. All defense mech equipment, all newer firmware, most blamed on human error. Garver stared at the circles. Fort Stewart, Fort Irwin, Bragg, even that air base in Montana. Exactly. They're building a behavioral profile of the entire combat logistics wing. Red nodded. "And they're doing it without telling the DoD. This is all classified as internal product telemetry." Buried in the vendor-side service agreements, Garver shook his head. "That's not just shady, that's treasonous." Red gave a tired smile. "Not if it's labeled R&D." Garver stood up. "We need to shut this down." Red remained seated. "Already tried." "What happened?" "I got erased." "Or didn't you wonder why I suddenly vanished 6 months ago?" Garver sat back down. "They sent a guy after me. Not to kill me, just to convince me. Gave me a check, threatened my past, told me I'd complicate the integrity of the program, so I left." "Why are you back?" Red leaned forward. "Because they made the mistake of tracking one of their test modules through a fleet bird. That Lakota you fixed. That was the first time the failure pattern repeated without their uplink's authorization. You tripped an alarm without even knowing it. They didn't mean for it to fail." "No." "And now they're nervous, which means they're about to accelerate." Garver exhaled. "This thing's gonna spiral, isn't it? Unless we hit it first." The plan was simple. Dangerous, illegal, and absolutely guaranteed to cause political migraines, but simple. Red still had access to the original signal shell root key. the same one he used months ago at Fort Knox to disable a covert uplink. Garver had access to the grounded fleet birds still housing Defense Mech's rogue chips. The goal: trigger a controlled fault trace that would force the system to expose itself. A ripple strong enough to light up the entire loop. The trick: it had to be done simultaneously across 3 bases. Any less, and the system would autocorrect and wipe the data. So they recruited, not officers, not techs, just old hands who knew better than to trust software over sweat. A warrant officer at Fort Bragg, a salty avionics chief at Irwin, and Garver at Stewart. 3 birds, 3 chips, 1 simultaneous flash signal. If it worked, the hidden network behind Project Sentry Loop would ping wide open. If it failed, well, they'd probably all be classified as rogue technical assets and quietly reassigned to oblivion. Garver was okay with that. He just wanted to hear the machine tell the truth one more time. At exactly 0200, Garver pulled the access panel on the CH-47. He clipped in the override jack, a frayed, ugly-looking cable Red had built by hand, and keyed in the command string. He waited. The chip blinked red, then yellow, then a quiet chirp. Same time at Irwin and Bragg, the same thing happened. The chirp meant the system had accepted the override. Red's signal bounced through the relay, and the network, that invisible behavioral metrics web built into the firmware backbone, did something it had never done before. It pinged back. In a trailer off-grid, Red watched the screen light up. Base IDs, uplink coordinates, data loop and points. He smiled for a moment, then his face changed, because on the screen, under the list of active test units, a new name appeared. Phase 2, Autonomous Correction Deployment Active. Red swore, because that meant one thing: the system was going live. It wasn't just tracking reactions anymore. It was about to change them, and it had already started when Red called Garver at 3:12 a.m. He didn't waste time with greetings. They flipped it, he said. Phase 2 is live. Garver was still half asleep, rubbing grit out of his eyes with one hand while reaching for his boots with the other. What do you mean flipped it? I mean Sentry Loop isn't just watching anymore. It's correcting. Garver paused. Explain. Red's voice was flat. There's a new module buried inside the latest firmware drop. It flags deviation clusters. If a soldier, pilot, tech, engineer deviates too far from expected behavior during a system fault, the module adjusts the system to reduce risk of human miscalculation. Garver sat upright. That's just a sanitized way of saying it's gonna start lying to people until they behave predictably. Exactly. And if they don't, then the system restricts access, slows feedback, eventually simulates a normal response even when the machine's failing. So it convinces them nothing's wrong until something is. Red's voice went quiet. I just watched a maintenance chief at Irwin sign off on a faulty hydraulic loop because the readout said stable. He swore it looked off. But the machine told him he was wrong, so he believed it. Garver stood up. Nope, we're not playing this game. By 6:00 a.m., Garver was back on Fort Stewart staring at the CH-47, the same bird he'd fixed 2 days earlier. Only now the diagnostic screen glowed a little too cheerfully. Everything green, everything optimal. He wasn't buying it. He opened the same panel as before, hooked up Red's cable, and ran a sweep. The chip was still there, only now it was writing data, not just storing it. More troubling, a line of code at the bottom of the debug log read, behavioral flag, D3/override suggestion, silent confidence. What the hell does that mean? He muttered. Behind him, someone cleared their throat. He turned, a man in a suit, black, slim. Hair perfectly in place like it had been painted on. No name tag, no rank, just presence. Mr. Garver, the man said. Can we talk? No, the man smiled slightly. It's about your recent activity. Garver reached for his pouch. You here to threaten me? Not at all. Just to offer you an opportunity. Garver kept one hand near the crowbar hanging from the side of the chopper. Is that what you call cleaning up failed experiments? The man stepped closer. You've got to understand this isn't about malice. It's progress. Every evolution of warfare has required adjustment. Emotional feedback loops slow response. Sentry loop makes outcomes cleaner. Garver laughed, sharp and short. You're dressing a bullet wound in a lab coat and calling it surgery. It reduces casualties. It reduces thinking. They stared at each other. Then the man said, "This isn't personal. But if you keep interfering, you won't just disappear from base records like your friend Red. You'll disappear from everywhere." Garver smiled. "Funny thing about people like me, we were invisible before it was fashionable." Then he swung the crowbar, not at the man, at the chip. A single blow, sparks. The casing cracked, wiring split. The screen glitched. The system screamed in error code. Garver turned. "Now it's personal." Red called 5 minutes later. "You fried a chip, didn't you?" "Yup." "Good. Because I just got hit with a signal trace. They're trying to backtrack every node we used for the override." "Scrub your path." "Already did, but they'll keep coming." Garver grabbed his go bag. "Then let's give them a trail to follow." Red was silent. Then, "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Only one way to end this." They headed to Fort Knox, not because it was safe, but because it was central. Redstone had the airframes. Stewart had the fleet logs. But Knox had the integration server, the place where defense mech's data loops met with actual military records. It was supposed to be air-gapped, which is why it was the perfect lie. Red got them into the access wing using his old ID badge, still erased from official systems, but not from every backdoor. Garver handled the wiring, the screens. Together, they rerouted the access logs to a dummy console and connected a signal rebroadcaster, small enough to fit in a coffee cup, strong enough to send a signal across the entire military maintenance network for 8 seconds before getting cut. 8 seconds was enough. They ran the script, and in 8 seconds, every defense mech-infected system from Montana to Bahrain got one final update, a full trace of Sentry Loop's hidden commands, every forced override, every adjusted readout, every flagged human as unpredictable. It all spilled out like water through a cracked dam. Garver leaned back. Red cracked his neck. "That's gonna leave a mark." "Good," Garver said. "Maybe next time they'll build a system that assumes the user isn't an idiot." Then the alarms went off. They didn't run. They just walked. By the time base security arrived, both men were standing in the courtyard, arms folded, waiting. Garver nodded at the officer. "We just sent a ghost protocol into every bird on your field." "Is that a threat?" "No," Red said. "It's a mirror." The officer raised a brow. "Check your diagnostics." He did. And for the first time since the retrofits began, every readout turned honest. The hidden chips were exposed. The override signals disconnected. The machines were finally silent. No more tricks, no more tests, just engines waiting to work or break. The way they always had. Garver and Red were detained, officially, for questioning. Unofficially, they were thanked by every pilot who'd ever second-guessed a system that said all good when their gut screamed otherwise. The investigation into defense mech launched quietly. Their project was scrubbed, the contracts reviewed, the firmware redacted. Of course, no one went to jail, they never do, but something changed. A memo circulated across command. System optimization must never outrank human instinct. Machines support decisions. They don't make them. Red called it a small win. Garver called it breathing room. Both knew it wouldn't last. But for the first time in a long time, the machines weren't lying. 2 weeks after the data dump, Fort Knox held a town hall. Not for civilians, for service members. It wasn't on the books. No flags. No press. Just folding chairs in the old hangar, the one that still smelled like grease and thermals and dusty metal. At the front stood Colonel Delaney, flown in from Fort Bragg. Garver and Red were there too, technically still under investigation, but no one was treating them like prisoners. Delaney took a breath. What we saw in those logs was more than a system malfunction. It was engineered deception, and it targeted the one thing this uniform relies on above all: human judgment. He let that hang. You all know someone who trusted their gut when a machine said fine. Sometimes they were right, sometimes not. But we didn't join the army to let software second-guess our instincts. A silence moved through the room like wind. Then he gestured toward Garver and Red. These two didn't just uncover a bug. They exposed a design. One that was never meant to protect us, only to predict us. That's not defense, that's surveillance. Murmurs. Then a voice from the crowd, a mechanic named Torres who nearly crashed during a training flight weeks prior. So what now? Delaney smiled grimly. Now, we remember. The Pentagon never issued a press release. Of course not. Instead, defense mechs contracts were deprioritized. Their influence quietly dismantled from inside the procurement chain. Their firmware updates were pulled, scrubbed, and replaced with open-spec modules that could be publicly audited. Garver laughed when he read that. Open-spec, he muttered. That's the military version of putting a sticky note on a bear trap that says watch your step. Red didn't laugh. He was already packing. You leaving again? Garver asked, watching him fold a flannel shirt like it was the only one he owned. Not leaving, Red said. Just not staying. Same thing. Red looked up. No, staying means growing roots. Leaving means staying useful. Garver didn't argue. Where will you go? Where the next lies hiding. Garver paused. That's a hell of a compass. Red shrugged. It's the only one they haven't broken yet. On his last day at Fort Knox, Red stopped by the CH-47, the same bird, clean now, honest. He climbed into the cockpit, ran a hand along the throttle like an old friend's shoulder. Then, with a black Sharpie, he wrote a message on the side panel beneath the pilot's seat, not where it would be obvious, but where only someone really looking would find it. If it feels wrong, it probably is. Trust that. R. He closed the panel and disappeared again. Garver stuck around a little longer, not because he liked the heat or the constant requests to consult on things that didn't need fixing, but because the younger techs had started asking questions, not just about the birds, about how to think like them. How do you know when something's off? One of them asked him during a systems class. Garver scratched his beard. You don't. You feel it first, then you prove it, in that order. But how do you trust that feeling? Garver looked at the kid like he'd asked how to trust gravity. Because machines don't lie on purpose. People program them to. The room went still, and for the first time they weren't looking at a crusty vet. They were looking at a blueprint. 1 month later, Garver got a letter in the mail. No return address. No seal. Inside, a photo. Red standing outside a hangar that wasn't from any American base Garver recognized. Maybe Poland. Maybe Turkey. Hard to say. On the hangar wall behind him, the same message he'd written on the CH-47 panel was stenciled in paint. Big, bold, not hidden this time. If it feels wrong, it probably is. Trust that. And below it, spray-painted in black, the judgment line. Garver grinned. A name. A movement. Red wasn't disappearing this time. He was spreading. Within a year, whispers about the judgment line circled through bases like folklore. Not organized, just respected. No memberships. No pins. Just a question asked quietly between mechanics and pilots. Do you follow the line? It meant you didn't blindly trust software. It meant you reported anomalies even if diagnostics disagreed. It meant, when something felt off, you didn't wait to be wrong politely, you checked. Some brass hated it, too rebellious, too unstructured, but others embraced it. Because in a world where systems talked louder than people, someone had to remind the machines who they worked for. And that's how it stayed, quiet, steady, everywhere and nowhere. As for Garver, he never went fully back to the field. He still fixed things, still drank black coffee, still carried that same frayed crowbar in the back of his truck, just in case something needed breaking. But more than that, he listened. To the rotor noise when it dipped a half beat too slow, to the coolant hum when it stuttered under pressure. To the silence before a stall, the kind of silence no computer could diagnose. He didn't talk much, didn't need to, because these days when something failed, people didn't ask what the system said, they asked Garver, and somewhere out there, Red smiled. Because, in a world full of voices pretending to be answers, it turns out the loudest truth came from two old ghosts with grease on their hands and no patience for lies.